Hi, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Sarah Noble. I'm a director with Deloitte Supply Chain Practice here in the UK and focus specifically on the automotive industry. Well, we're finally in 2021, and I've been asked to give a bit more detail on what we see coming out of the new trade deal between the EU and the UK and how we think that's going to impact the wider UK economy. So news of this deal has been a big sigh of relief for many businesses. It's the culmination of 4 years of negotiations, but there's a lot of text to look at. And so it's easy to think that there is too much detail to want to spend your time on. But actually what we're going to do is talk about kind of the key notable inclusions, specifically which impact the automotive industry. There is a fundamental change for businesses. And so it's really important to understand all of the different areas that are included within this new trade deal. The first, which I think is really important to mention, is we do have tariff-free, quota-free trade. So this is a big success point. This goes further on tariffs than we've seen from any other FTA that the EU has joined in, and it's really good news for businesses. The important note for automotive, however, is going to be around the rules of origin. I'm going to spend a bit more time on that later in the session, but what's really important to note is those rules of origin requirements are important across the UK and the EU. So we have bilateral accumulation, which is very important to how we move forward. There is a 6-year phase-in period for electric cars, which I'll talk about what that looks like. And actually what makes this a bit easier is the ability to self-certify with detailed proof of what this looks like, not being required through until 2022. So there's a bit of time to adjust to that and what that looks like, but it's still probably one of the biggest impacts for the automotive industry and one to keep an eye on. Some other areas that might be of interest: mutual recognition of AEO, which is Authorized Economic Operator. So that means that if you have that within the UK, either full or S, then you'll be recognized for that in other EU countries. One point that I think a lot of companies were worried about is around your ability to move people and actually our access to individuals going forward. Now, what this really looks like is there some really positive things. So there is the ability for visa-free business travel, which is important. So the requirements are slightly different whether you're going to the UK or the EU, but both of them offer quite a bit of flexibility. There is limited ability to recruit across those borders without going into a visa process, which the UK has laid out very clearly what that looks like in a new points-based system. And that was available even before we hit the 31st of December. I think the main point that was a real positive for many people coming out of the TACA was around Social Security contributions and what that means for individuals who have been working outside of their home country, and the fact that that will continue to be protected going forward. I think one of the big areas that we haven't seen a whole lot of information on yet is around data adequacy. So if you're thinking GDPR, sharing of personal data, actually that's an area that there is a bridging agreement in place, and there is no more information expected until further discussions happen over the next 4 to 6 months. There are still steps that could be taken by a company, but I think what's really important is that we need to kind of keep an eye on that going forward. I think that the second that is auto-specific in terms of how it's going to have a big impact is very specifically around regulatory divergence. So this isn't a day one panic for many individuals, and I'll go into more discussion on this later. But I think what's really important is that there has been, as we expected, an agreement to go separate ways and have true individual sovereignty and autonomy between the UK and the EU in terms of setting that certification process, testing processes, which is important as we come to type approvals, conformity assessments, etc. That will start to diverge in the future, though there are working groups in place to try and minimize that. As well, I think it's worth noting, we know that there have been some immediate changes at the border. We know that though it's difficult to talk about Brexit without also talking about the ongoing impacts of COVID, and combining those two means that we are starting to see some impacts of delays at the border. I think the Irish border is one that has already started to be a real pain point. But as we go forward, we expect that to continue. I think at the start of January, we were only looking at about 20% of normal traffic going across the UK-EU border. So it really hadn't been tested at that time. I think what's really important to note as we go forward on this is how companies are prepared to adjust to the changes that are now in place. So they include more wide areas such as tax, such as specific automotive, annex that will have very specific guidance on areas, and such as VAT and withholding and how each individual company handles that. It's going to be really important to work with suppliers, to work with OEMs, and to really work across that supply chain and the whole chain for how we develop vehicles and how we get them to market and what that looks like going forward. There's going to be a need for some real partnership. I think what's most important to take away from the TCA, as much as, yes, sigh of relief, we're in a really positive place, positive as we probably could have hoped for overall, is the fact that this is not the end of the journey that we're on. So as much as we might stop talking Brexit as a term going forward, this negotiation period is going to continue for many aspects of this. As mentioned, data adequacy will be one of them. Financial services will be another that continues to be looked at. And really, this will be up for review in only 4 years. So over that time, lots of things may change and lots of things may start to shift. So it's important to keep an eye on what this means for your business going forward. So looking at regulatory divergence and what that means for the industry, the real impact here is that going forward, both the UK and the EU will have sovereignty to set what their regulations look like. There's a couple key areas that this impacts the automotive industry. So first, and probably one of the biggest, is around type approval and wider conformity assessments. What this means is, at this time, there is unlikely to be a massive impact in 2021. There is an agreement that there will be some time to put new approvals as well as new approval numbers in place and get those completed. However, going forward, we may start to find that each of these geographies start to set slightly different processes and testing requirements, and that could be quite a large financial burden on individual companies to be able to match that. In addition, we already knew that CO2 and CAFE implications were going to start diverging. So no longer can the UK numbers be included in your EU reporting, an expectation that there will be reporting required on a UK basis as well. One I want to note, and this is one that goes to my earlier point around data adequacy, is connected cars are a complexity for all of us to be considering. So data is transferred from a vehicle back to the center in an effort, and this is in an effort to advance user experience, but this also means that there is personal data potentially moving across borders. Now, right now, as I mentioned, we're in a 4 to 6 month period where they're continuing to look at that, and we are hopeful that the UK will be viewed as adequate by the EU and let that continue. However, it's one that needs to be monitored very closely, because if that is something that does not take place, companies will need to take very significant steps in order to reduce their risk in terms of continuing business. Another one that many companies talked about, and I know it was a conversation I had significant many times in the lead up to the 31st, is around chemical reporting. So REACH reporting is a common term that you'll hear, and that is around the requirement for chemical substances that are moved in and out of the UK and the EU to be reported. Now, there needs to be confirmation of the legal entity that is doing that reporting on behalf of the entity moving it. There needs to be a check for actually how much you're moving now into the EU as a separate entity versus the UK. And the UK will be setting up their own REACH reporting requirements. So you will need to have in place going forward the ability to report that separately for the UK versus the EU, and be able to continue that process in place, but have it separated out with the appropriate legal entities responsible for the reporting. Interestingly enough, as I talked earlier, I think rules of origin is one that is hitting the automotive industry, both positives and negatives, I'm hearing actually. So I think what we have in place is bilateral accumulation, which means that those items that are from both the UK and the EU will be counted towards local content. So this is good news going forward, which was not a surprise. I think it's one that we expected. I think what we do not have going forward is diagonal accumulation, which means that, and this is something the UK very much was looking for, but this means that goods coming from a country like Japan, which despite having trade agreements with both the UK and the EU, will not count as qualifying content. So the impact of this is tariffs. It means that though there is absolutely the option for OEMs to operate without tariffs for any of their vehicles that they're moving, we might be facing a situation where you will have tariffs to contend with due to the rules of origin and the content of the manufacturing of the vehicle or car or truck, and I'll talk through some of those. The requirement that has been set is that 45% is the maximum for non-originating materials. What that means is 55% of your vehicle needs to have EU or UK regional-based content. Now, this number applies for internal combustion vehicles, buses, tractors, semi-trailers, and some special purpose vehicles. There's a lot of data available on the government websites, so it's worth understanding quite specifically the different zones and tariffs that your specific items will fall into. Parts are at 50%. So for all parts, if you're selling parts, you'll need to have 50% regional value content going forward. Now, I think what's interesting here is there was quite a bit of time spent and put forward against the electric vehicles. So electric vehicles are actually going to go through a more of a process going forward. So for EVs, it's currently 40% regional requirement for the UK and the EU. That's for all HEVs, PHEVs, EVs. Some minor exceptions to this, but I think as a general statement, we're there. That is going to apply until 2023. It's worth noting that there's going to be a phasing in of more stringent rules of origin requirements that'll happen from 2024 onwards until we get to the same levels as legacy ICE from 2027. So positive that there is a phase-in period and that in the immediate, there is still the opportunity to not have significant tariff impacts on those EV vehicles, especially as that is areas that are big points for growth across most of our OEMs and auto industry. But really important to note that that will be changing over the next few years, and what that means for a company's strategic plans as well as their model mix will be one to definitely keep in mind. The last section on Brexit I wanted to go into in a bit more detail is specifically around what we're seeing now at the borders, what this means for trade, and what this means for customs and actual kind of the end customer and what they're going to see, probably in more the short to medium term. So the reality is, as I said earlier, it's hard to talk separately about COVID-19 impacts and Brexit impacts. Many of our companies across the industry are facing a lot of vulnerabilities. There is a decrease on customer sales because customers aren't able to go out and buy vehicles in the same way they used to. There's a decrease in production, which at points is considered a good thing, given the fact that there is not enough supply coming in at different times, and there has been kind of points across all of the supply chain globally where there have been failures and disruption. I think what's important for companies to do and continue to do going forward on this is understand how your suppliers are doing, spend some time understanding the criticality they pose within your business, understand the preparedness they have. So I think in these early weeks of January, a lot of what we're hearing is, despite significant communication that went out over the course of 2020 and the many years before, there's still confusion over what customs requirements are. There is confusion over the paperwork required to move goods, and there is confusion over the role a lot of those suppliers need to play within those processes that now exist. I think it's really important to be working closely with suppliers and OEMs to make sure that's as smooth as possible and the right support is in place to move those forward. The reality is we are facing delays at the border, even with some of the minimum number of vehicles and container freighters moving at 20%, as I said, we're still seeing delays. And so even if your company is prepared, the reality is you could get behind a company that is not as prepared. So there's really probably no one who's going to be completely immune to some of these delays that are being faced. It's limiting a lot of the network capacity. So we know that there is a global issue happening over the past few weeks around container shortages, and there's been some continued issues with that, and that will continue to kind of knock-on effect going forward, and one that we'll want to keep a close eye on, and you'll want to work closely with your different suppliers as they try to adapt to that. I think the number one thing to take away and consider on as you look at your supply chain production capabilities is how to balance production constraints that you'll start to feel around what will start to hopefully be, as we move more into 2021, an economy that starts to shift, it starts to feel more positive. And I'll talk more about the economy, but as we look at that and we do have a view that that will start to improve over the course of the year, you want to try and find the balance as much as possible and understand where you can make some shifts now to give yourself a bit more flexibility and agility in your production and your sales planning. I'll close by spending a few minutes talking more about what we see happening in the UK economy. So looking at the impact of all this on the UK economy, from an economic perspective, I'm going to share kind of 4 key views that our Deloitte chief economist, Ian Stewart, has put forward, and I think really resonate both for the automotive industry and wider. And I'm going to balance that against our Deloitte Cfo Survey, which was completed at the end of 2020 and just released in January. First, I think it's really important for all of us to agree, as I said at the start, under the circumstances, this is a positive result to have a deal in place. It's an achievement even before COVID-19 hit the scene, given the timelines that they were facing, for a deal to have come to agreement by the end of the year. Second, a deal is good news for the UK economy. It brings a lot of clarity for businesses and really gives a positive feeling for consumers as well as we move into the new year. The sterling rallied significantly at the end of the year. Multiple businesses came forward to talk about the positive results that they would expect with the effect of the deal. In addition, I think it's important to note that we had done a no deal forecast for UK GDP in 2021, which would have been 1.3% lower than our current forecast, which is at 4.4% predicted based on a deal in place. I think that speaks to a lot of the confidence that a deal puts both in business leaders as well as consumers as we look at 2021 and beyond for the UK. Specifically, looking at some of our results from the CFO survey, 2/3 of CFOs expected a significant negative or severe impact on the UK growth had we had a no-deal Brexit faced on the 31st of December. By contrast, there's a lot more positive feeling now that we have a deal in place, only 19% still thinking that we're going to have some negative impacts to be dealt with. I'd balance that against looking at kind of pandemic recovery more broadly and say that 78% of CFOs expect restrictions on movement and wider impacts of COVID to really continue strongly in the first half of 2021. But 2/3 actually think that as we come into the second half of 2021, we'll start to see a return to pre-pandemic levels of revenue. So there are some positive thinking happening across each of those and ones to keep in mind in terms of how we balance. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't spend a few minutes just talking about the fact that, yes, it is incredibly positive that we have a deal. However, the fact that the UK has left the EU means that we have created a more distant and complex relationship. Now, the impact of a more distant and complex relationship generally tends to mean more paperwork and more bureaucracy, which for many businesses will lead to more costs. For instance, HMRC has been quite clear in stating that they think that there will be close to $7 billion a year of additional costs for businesses from new customs declarations and paperwork required on a regular basis. We know that lower migration to the UK will reduce overall GDP growth. However, the impact on per capita GDP growth may not be as negative. It's a bit less clear at this time because, as you might assume, higher earning migrants contribute more to GDP growth per capita than those on lower pay. We don't really know what that's going to look like yet. I think if we think about more complex economic models, and I won't go into too much detail on that, I think the reality is most economic models predict a reduction in long-term GDP for the UK. I think that said, some of the shorter-term risks for Brexit that have been focused on, such as treasury forecasts of a vote triggering a recession immediately, they haven't yet appeared. So it could be that though there was a lot of really negative forecasts in place, we don't really know what that's going to look like in the long term. Though I think really mainstream thinking is definitely that we're not going to see growth at quite the same trajectory as we might have had we stayed working with the EU. And I think the last point I'll make before happy to open up for questions is really around thinking and reiterating the fact that this is not the end of the story. The EU-UK deal is not finalized forever. It will be reviewed, as I mentioned, over the next years. There are areas which still need to be discussed further, such as data and financial areas. And the reality is, there's a real appetite, given everything happening, for there to be ongoing dialogue and discussions around how this is working and how this can continue to be improved. So there are some immediate things to be aware of as a business and to take into account, but we're definitely not at the end of the challenges that will be faced, and the recovery both in wider economy from the pandemic as well as from ongoing impacts of Brexit will keep the UK busy for probably many years to come. Happy to take some questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Rose, the editor of AM, and as you've just heard from Sarah and Andy Mee, the managing director of Motor Docs, now join me live to answer some of the questions that you've sent in. You do still have time to send more in, so I think we're allowing about 10 minutes or so to do this Q&A. So by all means, get typing and pick our guests' brains for any nuggets that you can get to take away and influence, I guess, the strategy for your business. So we've had a few questions coming in already. The first one, which I think I'll put to both of you, Sarah and Andy, is automotive retail yet to feel the fallout from Brexit? What would be the most hard-hitting, and what can dealers do to prepare? Perhaps we come to you first, Sarah.
Sure. Thanks very much, Tim. So I think the reality we have is COVID-19 has taken over a lot of the discussion, planning, and impact than really Brexit even has yet. So to be honest, I don't think most retailers have fully felt the fallout of Brexit. Clearly, there has been impact over the past 2 years, just with preparations, as well as the different deadlines that have been faced. Those have caused a variety of impacts. But I think the reality is, as we start to see an increase in the movement of goods in and out of the UK, which has been really minimal so far, then we're going to see more delays, which is going to impact retailers, their ability to do that. I think we still haven't seen the changes to pricing fully come through across a lot of the different brands. And as that comes through over the next few months, and even potentially years, I think that will start to have much more of an impact. But Andy, what's your view?
Yeah, I think I would share that. I think the impact's yet to feed through, and people's minds are being taken over by COVID, and so I think that's yet to be fully fed through, or I guess addressed as well. And so I guess it's watch this space in terms of what impact that does have as the full implications are fully felt.
Absolutely. Sarah, you mentioned their pricing. Obviously, in the run-up to the end of last year, several manufacturers had mentioned that they might have to adjust their pricing this year, whether there was a trade deal or not. Do you think there will be some kind of consequences for ultimately the car buying consumer as the year pans out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as I talked about rules of origin, I think the impact of those tariffs, some OEMs really know what those impacts are quite quickly. I'll be honest, I know some of them are still working through what exactly that looks like from their models. And when you're talking about potentially upwards of 10% impact there, you're going to have to see a cost change that gets passed on to the consumer with that. And then I think, beyond just, tariff impacts, the reality is business is going to have more steps in it, right? There's an increased cost from customs, there's increased cost across many areas. And it might not feel like an immediate Brexit impact, but the consumer will feel that over the next few years.
Okay, thank you. looking kind of further out, there's a question coming asking how many years do we expect to feel the economic consequences of COVID-19, and what can businesses do to reduce the impact? Again, I'll ask you both for an answer to that. Perhaps we come to you first, Sarah, please, on that one.
Sure. I think I'll be honest, that is a really hard question to put a finger in the air on. Thanks for coming to me first, Tim. What I would say is I think we have not necessarily hit the bottom of the impact of COVID-19. I think the positive we have, though, is both with the UK economy, the deal that we have is still better than not having a deal. But I think a lot of companies have made a lot of pretty bold changes over the past 9 months to try and give themselves the agility that they need to get through that. So as much as I think COVID-19, we're going to feel this for, I mean, we're talking years, right? I think we're at least in the 3 to 5 year timeline, if not longer. I don't think it's going to necessarily be 2020 as a total disaster. I wouldn't go that far, but I do think there are years to come where we're going to see the impact of COVID continue to change how businesses operate, but also consumer spending, consumer confidence, which is a big part of that.
I guess, Andy, obviously as a businessman yourself, you'll be watching with a keen eye to see how long this pandemic plays out and the impact it will have on all automotive businesses, really, that you deal with.
Yeah, I think in some ways the automotive retail sector has come through the first 9 months of COVID, I guess, better than anybody would have imagined in April or May time. And those dealers that have taken the opportunity to completely relook at the whole way in which they transact with their customers online, digitising their processes, means that they're in a very good position, I think, coming through. I think, as you say, there's many trends that have happened during COVID-19 which are here to stay. Just the whole way in which we interact with people on Zoom and those sort of things. I think the other piece, as well as you say, is consumer spending, and I guess the other piece to it is how does the government pay for everything that's been spent in the last 9 months, and what impact does that have on businesses in terms of the capital gains, corporation tax, and how that then feeds through into investment decisions they may or may not be making. So I think possibly the COVID piece may well wash through quicker than the impact it has on the businesses from how we pay for it all. Which will take years to happen, and I guess we're yet to really see that any sign as to what that's going to look like.
I guess I don't know if you agree with this, Sarah, but I guess the combination of the run up to Brexit and the pandemic has forced businesses to kind of cut their cloth accordingly and actually perhaps kind of put their focus on being an efficient and capable of riding out any storm.
I think that's true. I mean, I'll be really honest. So my career path, not just auto, has been very supply chain focused, and I think until we started talking Brexit and then COVID hit, we were probably, the least known area of some businesses, right? We were not the popular folks, and yet I think we have been incredibly busy with questions around what all this means. So, and that's just one area. I think the reality of COVID is it has just made everything happen a lot faster in terms of businesses. They were already on this journey. Andy talked about digitization, total changes to retail, what that means. Businesses are on that journey. It's sped it up at a pace that I don't think anyone expected until COVID hit. But I think it does come down to it becomes agility, right? I also don't think, not to be the one to say it, but no one thinks that this is possibly the only pandemic and we now face in a lot of lifetimes. And so how do businesses completely rethink what a black swan event does to them and how they're preparing for it?
Okay. Yeah. And did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, the reality is when anything significant happens, if you take credit crunch in 2007, 8, 9, it makes businesses rethink, doesn't it? And you have to get right into a granular level to look at how your business operates and where you can squeeze the 1%ers. The old David Brailsford piece around where are the 1% improvements in your business, and finding a number of those that soon add up. And talking earlier on about other cost pressures, then you've got to find those 1%ers to be able to offset them. And in some ways, while you would never wish it on anybody, it does tend to mean that if you run your business very well, you tend to come out of it, the other end of it, in a better shape. And if you don't run your business very well and you don't respond quickly, then it's probably going to be quite challenging for you.
I think there's definitely a theme from both of you there in terms of the agility of the business to adapt and kind of deal with these issues. Just moving on to another question submitted by Kevin Brand, asking about the kind of potential for profitability. So manufacturers produced less vehicles last year, which has reduced the pressure on pre-registration activity, where obviously excess volume in the market and can have an impact on dealers' margins. So just interesting really in your perspective on what impact do you think this will now have on dealer profitability and manufacturer profitability as well, I guess.
I guess you want to dive in there.
I was just going to say, I guess in some ways it's the classic supply and demand, isn't it? If there's less supply and demand is still there, then prices should rise and profitability should improve. But conversely, if demand isn't there, then it's difficult to forecast what the impact would be. But yeah, so I think it's the classic supply and demand sort of equation.
Sarah, your perspective on that?
Yeah, I don't differ from Andy, to be honest. I think the reality we have is it's been a really difficult time in 2020 to have any view of what forecast looks like. It's why we faced the whole semiconductor issue over the past month, right? So it's why that you see a variety of OEMs stopping their production these days, and that's not really going to change, because I think by region, by country, there's a real difference in how consumers are changing their spending with COVID ongoing. And depending on what that looks like for vaccine rollout, et cetera, I think we're going to continue to see just an amazing difficulty for any kind of forecast and forecast accuracy. And when that comes into play, you're going to have a real issue to be able to drive, the right mix being in the right place at the right time, which therefore impacts everyone's profitability. So I don't think that's going to end, and I think realistically it probably will continue to have a negative impact on it.
Okay. Do you see any positives coming out of the next kind of 12, 24 months for the automotive industry in particular? Perhaps Sarah first on that one.
Yeah, I actually think there will be some positives. I think 12 months might be thinking a bit bold for them to truly come into play, if I'm honest there, Tim. But I think there is some real positivity in the fact that it has. I think a lot of manufacturers were moving a lot slower to kind of move themselves into different retail situations and different ways of selling cars, whether that's digital or whatever it might look like. And I think this has moved them along at a faster pace, which I think will help them actually adapt to kind of new expectations for consumers. And then I also think in many ways this will, I think it will offer challenges around electric vehicles and what that looks like for continued rollout, probably before it has benefits. But I think in the long run, and I again would say beyond 12 months, but I think in the long run it's going to have a benefit for the industry in terms of how it's adapted to that.
And Andy, your views?
Yeah, I think likewise around. I think the positive note will be that strong businesses will be stronger as a result of the last 12 months, and certainly you got the sense that they fell into two pockets. You had those businesses that were saying that we've really got to address this now, and if that means us investing some money now to address some of the challenges, let's do that and be fitter. And then other dealer groups that perhaps were hunkering down a bit. And I think the reality is those that have invested in the right skills and the right ways of dealing with customers and so on will be better for it, and I think we'll grow and we'll come out of it in a strong position.
I heard one consultancy suggest that the industry has moved on 7 years digitally in around 7 months. What would you concur with that, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, the speed at which, for my particular business, the decision making was in terms of, typically your sales cycle might be 6 to 9 months. It was happening in a month in terms of making the decision to actually digitize their processes. And, conversations we've been having with people pre-pandemic that were taking quite a while suddenly sped up. And I think that's exactly right. It just hugely accelerated what were already trends, but they just shot off.
Okay.
I'd also just add to that, Tim, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't comment on the benefit to diversity in the industry. So I think the ability to have, I think automotive has been known for a long time as being potentially lagging in terms of work-life balance, diversity at different levels, ability to kind of manage strong careers with external factors. And I think generally, yes, there's been some negatives in, disproportionate genders impacted by the pandemic. I think on a positive, I think we've seen some real positives across a lot of industries in terms of how diversity is being impacted in a really good way. So I think, that could be a real positive for the industry more widely as well.
I agree completely with that, Sarah. I think when our hand has been forced, lots of industries have shown that we can work in new ways of working. So it's if there are positives to take out of it, then that's something. So I think we've got one final question that's just come in. Many manufacturers have been reducing the size of the dealer networks and the number of dealerships. What's your view on whether this will significantly reduce the value of property portfolios? I don't know if you have a view on that at all, Sarah.
Ooh, I'm not sure if we're going to like the answer, but I think there is a risk of that over the next kind of long term. Again, I don't think that's an immediate, but I think if we look farther out, I think the reality is the high street is being impacted by some of the same things, and I would expect automotive to start to be impacted by some of those same impacts on people. Consumers are consuming differently, and how they go about getting that consumption is changing. And to the 7 years and 7 months, we're on that journey for the automotive industry as well.
Do you see that as an issue, Andy? I guess traditionally, for some particularly kind of owner-driven businesses, the property has been seen as the kind of pension pod in a way. So,
absolutely, yeah.
So it will bring some change there.
No, and I think you've got to believe it will have some impact on property portfolios. Again, as Sarah said, if you just look at what's happening to the high street, and that may well mean that some people are thinking exactly what their exit strategies are for their business. If all of a sudden you say that their plan was built around their property portfolio, difficult to know what the impact might be on the value of property portfolios, but I suspect people will be building that now into their sort of future planning around exiting from their business.
I guess so. Well, thank you very much. I think we're pretty much out of time, so we'll have to wrap up there. So thank you to Sarah Noble from Deloitte, and also Andy Mee from Motordocs. I encourage you to visit Motordocs' virtual stand, which is in Hall 2, I believe. And if you want to ask any further questions directly, please do there. But thank you for joining us, and thanks again to our guests.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.